you don't know me, with Jack Gardner, I've been at Keel Software to be, it's 9 years this year, 10 years next year. I do primarily consulting for, our cloud stuff, anything around healthcare. I actually started out as a JavaScript developer long time ago. And so I have always had a soft spot in my heart for things that are on the front end. It takes a different kind of person to do front end work than it does to do back end work. Front end people are very special. They're very different than almost every other type of person I've ever met. And in doing front end work, there's just two other things if you don't know about me. I really like to deliver functionality, and I really try not to make perfect the enemy of the good. I like to get things in people's hands. I think that's why I always enjoyed front end development, because you get to provide something that people can touch and feel, and it's the thing that people actually use and identify with. Vice presidents, they don't care if you're using REST or SOAP. They care about a color of a button. Like those are the kind of things that like those key stakeholders look at. So we're going to be talking about Vue. It's easiest to start sort of at the beginning and see how exactly we got to Vue. Just kind of in preparing this presentation, just starting out, that's the easiest way to get to where we're at. So to begin, when I started doing web development, things were very very It was very, not even dark mode, which is relatively new. It was miserable doing JavaScript development. My IDE of choice was Notepad, not even Notepad++. I'm talking Notepad. No syntax highlighting, no line numbers, no nothing. We had JavaScript files that were 5, 6, 7,000 lines long that had CSS and HTML embedded with them. It was nuts, the stuff that we were trying to do. And I was even developing before like Firebug came out. If anyone remembers, what it was like back then. When I wanted to debug things, I had to do alerts on all my variables just to see what their values were. Like, it was crazy. And I put America Online there not to necessarily call them out, but it was just kind of funny as I was reminiscing, about how miserable life used to be. And we even had to do things like one browser treated a functionality one way, and then IE6 treated it completely different. IE6 was always the oddball. No matter what you did, it never worked in IE6. So it was interesting too, because there was such a push to get more and more and more apps out of these sort of thick clients and onto web-based clients. And there was so much money being poured into it that you would have thought that we would have had a really good idea of what we were doing. I'm talking this is like early 2000s. No one had a clue for what they were doing, which is good in some way because we were trying new things constantly. I think like the first big project that I did, we had, a controller, a view, a model, a template, and then a CSS class. And that got us pretty far. There were some things that did not work very well. Passing data around from one component to another was miserable. You had these getters and you had these setters, and it was not very fun. The CSS, CSS is a very powerful tool, don't get me wrong. When we develop things, we typically develop them with like blinders on. You develop like a component and you only want the styles to affect that one component. Well, with CSS, it's intentionally cascading. So you would get in there and you'd be like Peter Griffin trying to adjust the blinds, You'd be like pulling one thing and then all of a sudden half of your app doesn't work and it turns like a weird shade of purple. It was fun, I use the term fun lightly. So now, as we move along, we eventually get to a point where it was like 2012, 2013, 2014, somewhere around there, where we really focus on like widget development. And like, what do I mean by a widget? It is a self-contained component. It doesn't have the MVC structure to it necessarily, but it is sort of a component in and of itself. And that is where React came in. That was sort of the bread and butter. That was the zeitgeist of the time that it really entered into, was having pure widget development. there were some interesting things that it brought to the table. One is that it did not do inheritance. In fact, they went out of their way to say, we are not doing class inheritance. Now, there are different schools of opinion on inheritance versus composition. Personally, since I'm talking, I get to expose you all to, my opinions. I think that it's more about right tool for the right job. Like, that's my overlying philosophy. Sometimes inheritance is awesome. Sometimes when you get into a class structure that are 6, 7, 8, 9 classes deep, and you try to make a change, it's nearly impossible to do that in a strongly typed language like Java or C#. It is almost impossible to do that in a language like JavaScript, where it's just the Wild West. It doesn't have really types built into it. It's really hard to do really good inheritance in JavaScript. There are some situations where it's fine, but that's okay. React, right or wrong, took the stance of no, you will never inherit anything ever. You will only do composition, which was a game changer. A lot of the frameworks for JavaScript before React came out were really from pure backend developers trying to apply their philosophies to web development. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work well. So this was like one of our very first opportunities as front-end developers to be like, no, like, this is our thing, hands off, we're only doing composition. React also simplified a lot of what you had to learn when you were learning a new framework. If you were to look at the docs for Angular, I mean, no offense, it's a really good cure for insomnia. It is very verbose, there's a lot of stuff that you have to learn in Angular. With React, there are 3 things that you need to know about. Props, which are things given to the component, state, which is the state of the component, and then functional components, where you don't have a class with like 10 different methods. Your component, your widget, is a function where you give it some stuff, props, it does some things, state, and then it returns the DOM. And it doesn't really return the DOM, I'll get to that in a second, but it is an in and then an out sort of mentality. What React also did for us, which it helps us prevent us from shooting ourselves in the foot, is prevent reflows and repaints. When we were doing old school web development, I'm talking like 07, 08, 09, we had like pieces of the app that would update, and then that would trigger other pieces of the app to update, which would then trigger other pieces of the app to update. And not only from a programming standpoint was that difficult to maintain, because you had to worry about data being passed, all of them, you had to code a lot of that stuff yourself. It would cause reflows and repaints, which to the lay means it looks like the app was slow. In reality, JavaScript, even though it's a single thread of execution, is actually rather fast. The slow part is fetching data from an API and then writing your changes or reading what's on there to the DOM, to the page. Those are really the only 2 things that are like fundamentally slow. And it gets really slow if you push and then you read from the DOM and then you push some more and then you read from the DOM some more and you get into that back and forth mentality. That's what really slows it down. It's not that it's necessarily slow, but the perceived performance was really what was affected by it. So React was like, all right, I'm going to take some of this out of your hands, whether you like it or not. When you have a React component, you give it what the DOM should be. You don't write directly to the DOM. You just give React what you want the user to see on the screen. And then it compares that to what's called the virtual DOM. And it's like, oh, even though I maybe passed you some additional props, you didn't give me back anything different than what's on the screen. So I'm not going to affect anything on the screen because you didn't have any changes for me to actually write out. Doing that speeds up the page a tremendous amount. It makes your coding a lot simpler too. because instead of having to do, all these different checks and, everything else, it does all that stuff for you, which is great. It makes life a lot simpler. Now, even in React, I'm a big React fanboy. It's funny, in 2015, I did a presentation on why you shouldn't use React. And now in 2022, this is like my 10th presentation on why someone should use React. So, I take what I say with a grain of salt. Over the course of 7 years, I changed my mind, as most of us do. Some things in React are still hard. How you do state management, there is still a lot of, I wouldn't say controversy. I don't think we've still found a really good way of managing state on the UI. There are a lot of libraries and a lot of attempts that people have made to get it right, but I still think that there's a fair amount that needs to be done. There's no consensus by far on how to do state management. Same thing with theming and styling. Styled components are really, really cool. They don't always work kind of like how you would think they work, and it's something that maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years, as React and as the front end library progresses, we're either going to have it figured out or we're going to have 4 new libraries that all have different ways of solving the problem, and we're still not going to have a consensus on it, which is okay. That's totally fine. I think front end people are the type of people that really like to push the envelope forward, and they're always thinking, how can we do things better? How can we do things not necessarily newer, but what are different ways that we can solve this problem that we're having? So with that, this is where we're kind of at when Vue came onto the scene. It was created by a former Googler after seeing and working on the Angular project, seeing how React solved certain problems and trying to figure out, well, rather than adapting Angular to that, how could we just take a fresh look with what we know Angular is doing, what we know React is doing, and sort of bridge the gap between the two? That's where Vue came from. So the easiest way to look at it is just to look at some very simple code. So Vue is also a widget or component, if you will, based system. It wants to have all of the pieces of a component wrapped up into a single atomic entity. The way that they do that is they have like a .vue, the VUE, not VIEW file, where you'll have a script tag that exports out what your component is, and then in the same file, you'll have your template. Now, when I started, this would have been like anathema. We have our CSS, we have our HTML, we have our JavaScript, but we kind of learned over the years from front-end development, it's actually really helpful to have all this stuff in one file, because you're going to have these 2 files open anyway in your IDE when you're working on any of these components, because you need to affect all these things anyway. So do you want to have 3 different files with 3 different tabs in your IDE, or do you just want to have 1 tab? You're probably just going to have 1 tab. And this, I would say, even takes it a bit farther, because this is baked into the library, whereas React lets you, separate out if you want to have a style JavaScript file, you can. This is sort of like a first class, everything built in component. It doesn't let you make as many choices as React. Even in just this simple file, you can see, how we would do this in React is completely different. And it's also different based on which project you're on, which architecture you're working with, what libraries they choose to bring in, how you're doing styling, how you're doing theming, how you're doing state management. All those choices need to be made in React. Whereas in Vue, very much like how Angular is, it makes a lot of those decisions for you. Right or wrong, that's the approach that they took. So there are, this is straight from their docs. This is a somewhat overly simplistic Vue component and what it looks like. Their docs are actually really good. They are about the same length, I would say, as React's. So it's definitely pared down from Angular by far. And they're really good because you can go through and get, sample code. You could see it running. It's actually probably one of the better documentations that I've seen. One of the knocks that people had against Vue for a long time is a lot of the internal documentation of the library was actually written in Mandarin. I don't think it was Cantonese. I think it was Mandarin, because the original developer of Vue and actually the core team, I think they're really based, like in China. So, Mandarin being, sort of the lingua franca there, like it can be somewhat difficult for non-Mandarin speakers to look at the docs in the same way that non-English speakers might have trouble looking at some of the documentation we produce. So, it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So to get into some of the features inside of Vue, this is what conditional rendering looks like. So you'll notice there's the h1 tag, and then it's V for, wait, can anyone guess what the V stands for? I'll take guesses. Close. Vue. Jamie had victory. So that was just slightly, it wasn't slightly wrong, it just was only half right. So Vue-if, and then you give it some variable. You'll go back to here. You'll notice that there's a export default, there's a data function, and it returns some text. This would kind of be a way for you to feed variables from your quote unquote render method and have them affect your template. And because it's an if else, it's always going to render the h1 tag. But what goes inside the h1 tag depends upon how that variable, which I called awesome, evaluates. If it's going to be truthy, then what's shown on the screen is an h1 with Vue is awesome. If it's not truthy, then it's going to be oh no, and then sad face. So conditional rendering, this is how you would do it. Fairly straightforward. It's kind of interesting. I would almost think that the if and the else would go inside of the h1 instead of being on the h1 itself, but that's their decision. That's their prerogative. They can do whatever they want. You can have computeds. So imagine you had a variable that represented the amount of time the user has been inactive on the system. Maybe you keep a little countdown clock somewhere letting them know, they have to move their mouse every 15 minutes. That variable is probably going to be some date variable, or it could even be like an integer variable for how many seconds it's been since they've moved the mouse. To a user, most people don't know how long 317 seconds is. I know it's 5 minutes and 17 seconds, but displaying the number 317, I mean, we got to have a little bit of empathy for our users. They can't do that kind of math themselves. So you compute what the value is based on, the variables, and then you can do things, like if the number is less than 60, maybe show red with 60 seconds, 59 seconds, 58 seconds. If it's greater than 60, but less than, 120, you would show 1 minute, 20 seconds. So it's still the same variable, but how you present it to the user, you have an opportunity to do something slightly different than showing the value itself. This one actually spoke to me because one of the state management library that we use on the React side, MobX, it allows us to do computeds. So it's very fun because you might have a computed that chains together 5 different variables, and your library is the one that knows, hey, this is when you actually need to update it. It allows, Vue allows you to have lifecycle events. So, maybe you create a component, but you don't immediately show it to the user. Maybe you wait for some additional activity to take place. Maybe you proactively create a bunch of these and you only show half of them. This would be especially useful in something like conditional rendering, where you have, think about Pinterest. Everyone loves Pinterest because you can scroll, and even though things are loading in and out, you don't have to press next page. You can have these components that are just sitting there waiting for someone to scroll into them. Then it actually shows the image, and then when someone scrolls out of it, it unshows the image. So those lifecycle events are something that are baked into Vue. React actually used to have lifecycle events. I think you could still use them if you wanted to. They honestly now treat them kind of like gas station sushi, to where it's like, like you could eat it. Like bad things might happen. You might not enjoy what happens to your body afterwards, but you could, if the price is right. React instead went the way of hooks, which I could do an entire 60-minute presentation on just hooks. But they have, for the purposes of this presentation, the React community has sort of abandoned these lifecycle events, whereas it's still baked into Vue. Vue has watchers. So in this example, I have some variable called count that gets returned out of my component. And I give it a list of different things that I'm watching. So one of the things that I'm watching for is count. So you'll notice that the name of the property on that object needs to match the name of the property that I'm returning from my list of data. And when that variable changes, my callback gets invoked, it gets passed the value of it, and then in this case, I'm just echoing out. So if you have a button, maybe how many, my kids are really into YouTube, so how many views, their videos are getting, if you had a button to like smash and subscribe, that would trigger that to be invoked. It's very similar to what I've seen in MobX with observers, where you can have these sort of state variables, you can have it listen to as they are changing, and you can have things that get called back as they're changing. So it's funny that there's a lot of things that Vue is doing that either the React community is also doing or is abandoned. So there's definitely the ability to sort of cross-pollinate. If you know React, you can get into Vue, as you can tell from this, very easily. Whether you want to, we'll talk about that like real quick. I promise. I never like to leave anyone hanging. You always got to get my opinions if you come to one of my talks. Events. So way back in the day, I was really, really big into events. I thought that we could have all these components sitting on the screen, and when something happens, they would emit an event, and anything that cared about that event could subscribe to it. It didn't need to know necessarily what was going to subscribe to it. It was a system of loosely coupled components that could just, emit events, in the same way that cows emit greenhouse gases. We just kind of get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I have, in the past couple of years, sort of changed my opinion on events. I understand why they do it. In API and sort of system backend architecture, events are super powerful. We use them for tons of stuff. Decoupling, having loosely coupled components is one of the important pieces of the microservice paradigm. Like we couldn't do microservices without events. So if you ask an API developer to design a UI framework, they're going to design exactly what they know. What ends up happening with events is you really use them to represent, at least on the UI, state. And once you get into that, you then have to figure out how you're going to do state management. When you have small little widgets, sure, that works for a very simplistic app. But here at Keyhole Software, we don't get contracted by our clients to work on simple apps that are just to-do lists. If you want that, like that's fine. There's a niche for that. We work on really complicated things. And, no matter how much ChatGPT, how much people talk about it, it's really, really hard to do a large scale application. Widgets help. They're not the end all be all because you're going to want to share state between multiple components. You might want to have different components all reacting to changes in the same state. And ChatGPT, I'm not throwing it under the bus. I think it's an amazing technology. If the business users don't know how to describe what they want to humans, they're not going to be able to describe it to a machine. They're not going to be able to have a large scale application with all these different pieces that know how to work together, and to have a group of developers working on this application year after year after year. Events are really just a shortcut to doing large scale state management. So there are some parallels that I would say that it has to what I've seen in React. Prop drilling, which if you want to get a React developer's blood to boil, like real quick, just mention prop drilling. Everyone has to do it. It's kind of like a rite of passage. It's like going to prom, like you do it and, you either have fun or you don't. You eventually, once you do prop drilling, you go down that rabbit hole, you realize, oh, large scale state management, that's probably a little bit better. Whether you choose Redux, whether you choose MobX, whether you go with, the native context API, it sort of depends on your use case. But no matter what, once you get to a medium or large size app, you're going to have state management, and events are just not going to cut it. There are some, I've tried to draw a little bit of, my Venn diagram, things that are the same, things that are different. Some of the things that are the same are absolutely essential. You cannot have a large JavaScript framework in, 2022, soon to be 2023, without doing the virtual DOM. I think composition is an extremely powerful tool. I have only wanted to use inheritance on the user interface maybe once every other quarter. I've sort of argued myself into doing it. Otherwise, I think composition is really it. It supports TypeScript, which I am probably in the minority of not enjoying TypeScript as much as everyone else does. That is a better conversation at a happy hour than over a coffee at a little afternoon. And then server-side rendering. We tend to go back and forth on server-side versus client-side rendering. Where I think we're at right now is server-side rendering is good for client user-facing applications. When you're not sure what type of device that your end user is using, maybe they're on a low-powered iPhone, 7. I don't even know if honestly those things still even run anymore. But it's very low power. Maybe their internet connectivity isn't great, and you don't want to bog down their phone with rendering your large JavaScript application. So you render the initial, state of it on the server. You give it to the client partially hydrated, and that at least lets them perceive that your application is working well. I think that's kind of where we're at. I just read something today that we were able to get 100 gigabytes per second connectivity from the ground to a satellite. So bandwidth, that might be becoming less of a concern if we can ship information up to one of Elon's satellites that quickly, which is just crazy. That's honestly better than my home connectivity with my internet service provider, of which I will not name, but is a very large, ad engine company. So some of the things that are just fundamentally different about it. Vue being sort of the love child of React and Angular, they had decisions for what they wanted to do. They chose to go the framework route. So it picked sort of the genes from Angular instead of the genes from React. Whether or not that's a good choice, it kind of depends. If you're working on a project where there is no senior UI architect, if you have a bunch of maybe senior UI developers or mid-level UI developers that don't understand some of the trade-offs that need to be made from one library versus another, or how to accomplish something in the best way, going with a framework is actually a legitimate and effective choice. If you have a senior UI architect that has been, beaten year after year after year by all the different changes that have come through in the JavaScript community, if they remember when those people tried to fork off Node into IO.js, a while ago, like if they've lived through the browser wars and they understand what it is, the capabilities of the developers, the capabilities of what they need to produce, they might tend to go towards a library instead of a framework. So it's very contextually heavy. Vue has chosen to stick with component lifecycle events. Those are your mounts, those are your unmounts. React has, I think it was about maybe 2.5 years ago, I think, when hooks came out. And after that, it obviated the need for component lifecycle events. So your code, it is slightly more complicated for React to evaluate it. And if something goes wrong, it gets a little bit difficult to figure out what exactly you're doing wrong. But hooks make your code so much more readable, so much easier to understand, and especially because it's 10 times harder to read code than it is to write code, having long-term code maintainability, that saves you dividends in the long run. The Vue team is supported by a very niche group of well-meaning folks. React is extremely community-driven. Facebook, whether you like Zuck or not, Facebook is the primary sponsor of like the core React team, but there's an entire community behind it that is constantly trying to push the envelope, constantly producing new versions of libraries. Some of that, can kind of stink, especially when you have new versions of something coming out like constantly. But, there's pros and cons. In Vue and in React, they still are very component oriented. Vue has everything in one file, React splits it up. The footprint, and this is where I think Vue has a slight edge to it. Vue's footprint is much smaller than React's. It is a much smaller library. It doesn't have as many features in it, which kind of makes sense why it's slightly smaller. So if you want to create a web application that will be used by the general population, us, people, normal people, and you're not creating an application that is for an internal application that is only used by employees of a company that are going to be on very well-defined machines that are going to have great internet connection. If you're doing one of those apps, I think React makes a lot of sense. But a general population app where you have rich functionality, rich features, I think Vue might have a slight advantage there. Vue still is a rather niche library. We get at Keyhole requests for Vue, I think a lot more, this year and maybe 2021, definitely than we did before that. I don't remember anyone coming to us asking for a Vue project in 2018 or 2019. So it's growing. It's still somewhat niche. And the documentation for it, the original documentation, I'll say, is in Mandarin, which as a non-Mandarin speaker, it's difficult if something went wrong and I wanted to go in there and really dive into the docs and see what the developers were intending by their code, that would be a little bit harder for me to do. I'd have to run it through ChatGPT. So when you need to pick any technology, there's many things to consider. One of them is if you need to hire developers to grow whatever product, whatever project you're working on, how easily are you going to be able to get those developers? Are you going to have to go the route of, trying to train people in COBOL because the only people that know COBOL are either, 6 feet under or they're 6 feet south of the equator, enjoying their retirement? Or are you going to choose something that is very ubiquitous? In the front end, I've lived through a lot. I remember when jQuery was it. And then I remember when Ember was it. And then I remember when Dojo was it. Like, the UI technologies are constantly changing, for better or for worse. So it's less about Mr. Right and more about Mr. Right now, where you plot the 3 contenders, be it Angular, React, and Vue, you put them into NPM trends. This is what I always do to see, how a library is going. You'll see React in that beautiful shade of orange is way ahead, almost an order of magnitude ahead of all of its other competitors. And this is how many times a particular NPM package has been downloaded, per day. So it actually scales out quite a bit more than this if you're thinking about total usage. Vue definitely is it's a good number too, but when I ran this, it only had about 4 million downloads. React, it's at 19 million downloads. So 4 versus 19, I'm not great at math, but I think that is, indicative. And that was just last year. If you zoom out to 2018 till now, you'll notice React is on a pretty steep upward curve. Now, granted, Vue is also on an upward curve, but it is not growing at a rate where it will catch up to React anytime soon. I mean, when I ran this chart back in like 2014, I don't even remember what the contenders were, but React was towards the bottom and Angular was definitely above it. So things can change. We didn't get into the technology business because we enjoyed being stagnant. We get into it because we like learning new things. So it is possible, I will say it's always possible, that Vue will overcome React. Will it overcome React in the next 2 to 3 years? I mean, that would be a really, really seismic shift. I think Facebook would have to go all in on VR, do absolutely nothing on React, crash and burn into the ground, and then maybe it has a chance of overlapping it. So I'm also big, if you're at a presentation and someone is trying to, present to you something and they don't tell you the downsides, then they're presenting it because they want to sell it to you. I don't get any kickbacks from Facebook. I don't get any kickbacks from, Google. I don't get any kickback. Like, I'm here to tell you all my honest opinion about these two particular frameworks. So React, even though I'm a big, React fanboy, I have, the React thing, tattooed right there. I don't, my wife won't let me get a tattoo, but that's another conversation. When you pick React, you still have a lot of decisions to make. It is a library, it is not a framework. Once you get over that initial hump, every single project I have ever been on, it takes, maybe 2, maybe 3 months of, just kind of getting the momentum, getting some inertia to it. There's an inflection point where productivity just goes off the charts. Once everyone has learned how React does things, it's amazing how quickly you can produce stuff once you pay the initial investment. And it is easy to find very experienced React developers. They're out there on the streets. I can see them right now. Metaphorically, they're there. They're not that hard to find. With Vue, it is easy to start because it is a framework. It makes a lot of choices for you. It's harder to find really skilled Vue developers. They're out there. I think they're behind the creek. They're not as easily visible as the React developers are. If you will hit a ceiling on productivity in Vue, that's harder to say. I haven't really been on a very large scale Vue project to know when sort of the decisions that the framework has made will cause churn and velocity to plummet. I haven't been on a large project. What I will say is on a React project, I have always seen productivity increase, to the moon, as the kids say. So would I recommend Vue? It depends. Whatever recommendations, I or anyone at Keel Software gives, it's very contextual. Software is not a one-size-fits-all business. There's no one product, there's no one service, there's no one particular library that will solve all possible use cases. Software is a dance. It's a very delicate dance of where you have to talk with end users, talk to them. End users, like they're really nice people. If you all haven't gotten the opportunity to talk to them, like they exist, they have children, they eat food, they sleep, they're just like us. They don't sit in front of a computer as much as we do, but they exist. You have to understand their needs. You have to understand the business's needs. You have to understand the stakeholders' needs. You have to understand the developers. You have to understand what context you're developing in. You have to understand what you're developing. Once you have those pieces in place, then you can make the recommendations. It's a very limited, kind of playing the hypothetical out, it's very limited where I would see in 2022 on the precipice of the ball dropping in Times Square in 2023, it's very limited where I would see Vue being used on a customer-facing web app where you have users in Africa with poor internet connectivity and phones that are produced by the aforementioned Silicon Valley billionaire. Maybe that would be a good use case for it. But the UI development, again, it's all about the right tool for the right job. I think UI development, more so than any other type of development, attracts a very specific type of person that is somewhat masochistic, that likes deriving pleasure from the pain of how difficult developing JavaScript can be at times, but they also like it because it's something that people touch, something that people can feel. This is what your application will be known by, how it is presented to the user, how it functions. You could have an amazing application that has amazing functionality, but if it looks like it was built in 1995, people aren't going to use it, unfortunately. And on JavaScript development, there still is no clear-cut winner. Even with React having a lion's share of the market share, there are still competing frameworks that are coming out constantly. I'm sure in the time that I've given this presentation, there have been at least 3 new JavaScript frameworks that have come out. Whether or not any of them will amount to anything doesn't matter as much as the fact that it indicates there's still no clear-cut winner on how we do UI development. We seem to be going towards component-driven composition over inheritance. Still not set in stone. Now, React is a pretty good choice. Without knowing anything about any project, I would say that React is probably a really good decision to make. It kind of depends on what you want to do, kind of depends on new developers. It just depends. Now, Vue might catch up. Maybe I'll be giving this presentation in 2028, and I'll be, I'll have the Vue, like V tattooed over here. I don't know. What I will say though is that developing software is extremely hard. It's probably one of the hardest endeavors, second only maybe to making the spaceships, I think, that mankind has ever endeavored on. It is 10 times harder to read code than it is to write code. Code does not age like wine. It ages more like milk that has been left out by my children. Like it does not age very quickly, which just means that if you're going to be in the software business, you always need to be thinking about how do you drive the envelope forward. Even if you have a really successful product, it's sitting out there on the marketplace, if you're not adding features to it, if you're not these UI developers that are constantly thinking about how to do UI development better, you're not staying the same. You're not staying at the status quo. You're actually losing ground to all of your competitors. UI development is extremely, extremely exciting. It's extremely, extremely rewarding. Again, I'm not getting any kickbacks from Microsoft or Facebook. I will accept free swag. If anyone has free swag to send, I love free swag. But the recommendations that are in this recording are really specifically about how do you think through what Vue has to offer versus what React has to offer. And even then, it's not a question of do you use React or do you use Vue? It's really a question of what are you trying to accomplish? What we would recommend if we were working for a project at the DoD would probably be significantly different than if we were looking at, maybe an energy company or a healthcare company. The business problems, at least for us at Keyhole Software, those are the things to really think about. The technology comes second out of that. And if you want, if you like my opinions, if you want more information about Keyhole Software, if you hate my opinions, I totally understand, totally fine. I do not take it personally. Either way, in either of those events, ask the team at keyholesoftware.com is probably one of the easiest ways to get a hold of us to either have a presentation delivered at your company, or you want to meet for a beer and you want to yell at me. Like either of those options are totally fine. But what I hope everyone gets out of this is that UI development is just fundamentally hard. I wish with all my heart and soul that they would bake types into JavaScript. That would probably obviate half of the crazy things that we need to do if types were just a first-class citizen in the language. But They are not. Software development, intrinsically hard. And I hope all of you, whether you, use this in the future or whether you're just, kind of browsing around, I hope all of you eventually get to the point where you're really happy with your software development. I know it's not easy. If you want a shoulder to cry on, if you want someone to talk to, please come talk to us. So questions for me. Who wants to know something? Dave, yes, in the audience, in the peanut gallery. Life cycle events. But when you have hooks, it's like, why would you? Like if you're going from a 4-cylinder to a 6-cylinder, it's like you're not gonna be able to drive that 4-cylinder again. It's just never gonna feel right. Well, thank you all very much.